Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are now pleased to welcome Ms. Heather McMahon, the Senior Director of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, to our stage. Ms. McMahon presents an unclassified counterintelligence viewpoint, specifically what hostile foreign governments have done to exploit our boundaries and undermine our national advantages, but most importantly, what we can do about it. This keynote will be a fireside chat led by Army Cyber Institute sociologist, Major Jessica Dawson.
Good morning, Heather. I'm very excited for everyone to kind of hear what you have to talk about. Your background is in counterintelligence. So can you start us off with how you've seen the threat environment evolve over the last few years and where you see it's going?
Absolutely. Thank you. First of all, I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think the risks that we're facing in this domain, and certainly in the cyber domain, but also in the human domain and the economic domain, really are important to discuss as much as possible in a public forum, and that we can't possibly over-communicate about these risks and threats. Principally, what's changed over the last maybe 4 years is that finally there's a growing understanding that some of our vulnerabilities in cyberspace, in the supply chain, and in the human domain do have a real cost and impact. General McMaster is famous for many reasons, but also for saying that there's two ways that adversaries can attack us: unsuccessfully or asymmetrically. And clearly we've seen that adversaries such as the Chinese Communist Party, the governments of Russia, Iran, and others have certainly exploited us at the asymmetric level and found those boundaries and seams that exist between our partnerships, between our private-public partnerships, between our allies and partners around the world, and also within our own government and democracy to kind of exploit our inability to collectively bring our power to bear. I think the few important things that have happened is, one, we can talk about this threat now. We understand that intellectual property theft, which is one vehicle that I'll use to describe this risk to the audience because it's very visceral and there's a lot of evidence on this. Intellectual property theft has cost the United States and other democracies dearly over actual decades. Denny Blair and other former DNIs, the IP Commission, and others have valued the loss of intellectual property transfer sponsored by the Chinese Communist Party at between $225 billion to $600 billion a year. That's a staggering amount, and it didn't happen. It did not happen in a vacuum. Can you back up to the original slide? There we go. And at the same time as we've had adversaries identify these asymmetric risks and exploit them against us, we've had the transformative nature of technology, which has allowed us to have the military, economic, and technological advantages. This technology, as you in this audience very well know, is dual use in nature. Here's a semi-recent Washington Post political cartoon kind of describing, making light of this situation, perhaps gallows humor, but I think it's very apt. Here you have a person saying that, my Chinese clock is spying on me, my Chinese, other equipment has noticed us talking about this, and Facebook is exploiting our predicament, and we're under attack by our other, Chinese electronic equipment. I mean, this is making light of the situation, but how much different is that from actual reality at this point? We have knowingly inserted this technology in our lives, in our business processes, in our governments, even in our homes, without a full thought of the dual nature of that foundational technology, which, yes, allows us to bring immense power, intellect, logistics, everything to bear at a particular time and space. But a savvy adversary can look at that the other way and oppose us asymmetrically in ways that are difficult to attribute, that are cheap and easy for them to do comparatively versus all of the embedded infrastructure and effort and all the investment that we've made to make these technological advances possible to begin with.
So one of the things that you mentioned is the amount of loss that we've had from the intellectual property. How is that actually part of this asymmetric threat? What is the real impact of them just gaining access to, how to build the latest widget?
So, I mean, it's much broader than each individual cut, so to speak. We're kind of suffering, the famous death of 1,000 cuts. But I think China is not the only adversary here, but they really are the strongest one, and they're the best at practicing a whole of society, whole of government approach towards eroding our Western economic, military, and technological advantages. So it's important to talk about them. First, they've started with a strategy. If this slide is up, if you back up, yep, there we go. So here's, this slide depicts, that, hey, they have had a long-term strategy, and this is not a mystery. They publish it openly. You can read the Made in China 2025 plan. It outlines which technologies they intend to be key at, and they undertake blended attacks in order to use their whole of society, whole of government efforts to achieve their aims. And their aims are principally to transplant these Western companies, including our own, and replace them with their domestic control supply and export their ideology and their ideas on censorship and all of these other very intimate to everyone's lives throughout the globe, can be exported through the technology and the ways that they choose to leverage it and use their influence. So one, they started with a strategy. Read the Made in China 2025 plans, read all the other plans that come out after that. The Belt and Road Initiative is another great example of them being able to leverage a very, very hefty economic investment that has dual use. Yes, does it bring new facilities and new utilities, et cetera, to some underserved areas of the world? Absolutely. But it also affords an information environment that favors the Chinese Communist Party and disfavors free and open societies and democracies such as our own.
So when we talk about this idea of free and open societies, one of the strengths that China has is that it can leverage, it really is leveraging a whole of government, whole of society approach right now. How do we compete with that when we don't have that vertical integration from private sector to public? So how do we get the private sector to think about things in terms of risk and get government to provide some oversight and some assistance when we are dealing with things like intellectual property theft and that sort of?
Yeah, I think part of the problem has been to this point that we haven't communicated enough about what our risks are and what the threats are. When you look at the way that we have been working in the war on terror and the way the intelligence community has really been focused on intelligence and law enforcement on sharing information that pertains to risks and threats. We have not yet done that to the level that we need to on the front of protecting our critical technologies and intellectual properties. There are some great steps that are being taken at that issue, and we can't possibly do enough in those areas. It is an interesting, the way that this economic problem or this problem shows itself from the economic venue is that we have optimized, to support the Defense Department in the intelligence community. We have mostly prioritize how we would support the intelligence community in actions abroad in a combat zone. We haven't applied that thinking to what are the impacts of the supply chain. Can we trust all of our products? How should we be looking at the supply chain differently, and what measures should we put in place around our supply chains that should guide our economic decisions, and what are the things that we allow in our wires so that we know that we can trust it? Those are many of the things that we are just beginning to partner on with the private sector and also across departments and agencies inside the government. It's a very sort of a new field for the intelligence and counterintelligence discipline to be sharing that information, but we can't possibly share that information broadly enough in order to turn the tides on this problem.
So a lot of folks, eyes kind of glaze over when we start talking about supply chain and logistics,
Yeah.
and everybody knows that, the professionals talk logistics. But what are some specific examples when we talk about securing the supply chain from an intelligence perspective and the cybersecurity perspective? What are some examples of areas that you think that people in this audience could really kind of sink their teeth into and like specifically kind of conceptualize this?
So absolutely, and I'll out myself. 5 years ago, I thought supply chain was boring. I was a counterintelligence professional who thought supply chain was boring. And so I can admit that, and that was a big problem. Supply chain is not boring. Supply chain is what people do. And you should look at it more broadly than just, are we gonna bring in this widget from somewhere? Where is it from? Who made this? It's more broadly than just that. It's who designed the widget, who does the software upgrades to it, which parts of this end item are built by a foreign adversary state-owned enterprise, and do we think there's a problem with us getting those particular widgets from, let's say, a Chinese state-owned enterprise during a time of conflict? And if we do get it, should we trust it? The complexity that a lot of the technology that we've built makes it very difficult to predict where the vulnerability might be, but what you could predict is that there is a vulnerability. And if you look at all of these things together more broadly, I'm sorry, I talked about widgets, but you also have to talk about the people and the services that would access that facility. So supply chain is so much more than just stuff. It's who developed it, who designs it, who upgrades it, who brings it into the facility, where is it employed? If you're moving it into, and it's involved in an information domain and you move it to Hong Kong, does that mean that all the data is gonna definitely go to the Chinese Communist Party? So it is a very interesting, dynamic field that we all can't do enough in. The other thing that I've heard said about supply chain as well, it's too hard. It's too hard, the supply chains are too, imagine a giant octopus with 1,000 tendrils always moving because vendors change and all of that. But the thing here is that this is observable. You can see where these purchases are made at individual times. And there is publicly available information or information available to those who would avail themselves of looking at it that would point to the trustworthiness of the individual suppliers. And not just their personal trustworthiness, but what rules are they subjected to, particularly if they're operating in an adversarial nation. These are discrete knowables, and if we applied the same sort of talent like we applied to ad tech, driving us all crazy with targeted ads, if we took that IQ and applied it to this problem, this would not be a problem anymore. And that's the good news, because I think there is a growing field that the government is beginning to help seed along the way of private sector companies who are going to move into this field and be able to provide to the government faster, to government decision makers, where the most risk is along the supply chain, so that they can actually get around to doing something about it rather than fretting and hand-wringing. So I think that's very exciting.
You talk about risk, and one of the challenges that I think that sort of enabled us to get to this place is private companies are typically motivated by an economic incentive. So there has been a tremendous amount of economic incentive in moving things to the fastest, cheapest production location. How do we change the paradigm so that the incentive is not focused solely on the economic advantages, but really considering the risk? And how do we set conditions for these risks to be financially viable for smaller players, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a great question. And it is something that is happening. First of all, there's a lot of steps the government has taken or is in the midst of taking. One is that security is now a allowable cost in contracting. So that is slowly working its way through the system. And some of the costs of doing your security monitoring or purchasing items in the supply chain that would be cheaper if you bought the Chinese state-owned enterprise product, but more reliable if you didn't, a little more expensive, those costs are going to be factored in much better. The other thing is, I think this is not a conversation of should we have globalism or should we not have globalism. It's actually a conversation of, where is the middle ground on that. It makes sense to have supply chains that are wide-ranging and sustainable in a number of communities. You don't want giant disparity. And it's interesting, the IP theft issue in the United States, a lot of the theft has resulted in some of the areas of the United States being underserved. And there's a large, population of American workers who were left behind by globalism. So now that this is going to be an allowable cost, and others would make the argument that there's some unvalued risk in the system that maybe folks haven't realized that they're undercutting themselves yet by doing partnerships with Chinese state-owned enterprises who are going to steal your IP, build your successor company, and then take a loss leader on the product to knock you out of the market. I think there's a growing recognition of that. So I think we have an opportunity here, hopefully not to change the supply chain as a whip shot that industry hates for a lot of reasons, is very disruptive. But we have an opportunity here to help grow and foment through policy, through public understanding, through better private public partnerships. We're going to be able to grow the supply chain in different ways domestically and in other democracies that we choose to be allies with. That's going to benefit. It's going to benefit humankind, actually.
So when you look at China, one of the things I thought was fascinating in our lead-up conversations was kind of this way that China has really got this long-term strategy. Talk about where you think when you look at their acquisition strategy, how can we apply countering that acquisition strategy with tackling some of the consequences that we've seen from globalism?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things we can do. One, understand the threat. If you go back to their strategies, you can read them. They publish them open source. By the way, they also published the National Security Act of 2017 that every Chinese individual and company would support and promote the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence objectives, to include sharing your data and any of those things. I mean, they're compelled to comply. So one, understanding those things are important to turning the conversation around. But the other thing is, if you're a company and involved in a technology or a research lab, and you're involved in developing one of the technologies that's on a China 2025, 2030 plan, you will be targeted for IP theft. And this is observable. So you can take steps to make that harder. You can choose who you partner your research on more carefully. You can establish controls and parameters around that. You can use the savvy use of encryption. You can have different sorts of user agreements and employee agreements to harden yourself from the insider threat. There's a lot of steps that you can discreetly take, but pretending that you don't have a vulnerability or that you won't have, that will not get you out of this problem, and it will not get your technology to market in a way that advantages you or advantages free societies such as ourselves and other democracies.
One of the challenges that I hear you talking about in here is, we're talking about these companies' responsibilities to protect themselves, to harden their ability to be attacked on the intellectual property theft and the development. But where are the boundaries? One of the things that you hear people talking about these days is, this idea that we're all global citizens and that national boundaries don't matter anymore and we should do away with them. How do we convince companies that there are national interests at play and incentivize them to be aware of those, but also that government has an obligation, or maybe it doesn't? How do you feel about government having an obligation to help protect companies that are doing work that may be vulnerable?
So I think there's definitely some carrots and sticks, that can be used to improve this, but definitely the private sector is waking up to this issue. I think, to treat them all as one group, that, maybe the tech sector doesn't understand this. That's absolutely not true. Every organization, every individual is different, but by and large, the tech sector understands a lot about this. And, also fortunately for us, some of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party has been advancing their interests, we have bipartisan agreement that these sort of things are wrong. Kind of the overstep with trying to censor the NBA, is one example. And just the mere fact that you have Hollywood entities, Judd Apatow recently tweeted about this. There are others, the South Park program. South Park, makes fun of doing business with China, does a pretty good job of bringing some humor into it, but also stating, a lot of fact. Just that there is discussion on this topic from multiple political ideologies and multiple industries and other interest groups, I think is very important. I think earlier we were talking about the Uyghur groups in China, and I think they bring up an interesting point because the Chinese Communist Party in this case is employing technologies, partly some that we built in Western societies, and they're able to use that technology to limit individual freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, how you would culturally raise your children even in the home. They're able to use these technologies for bad. And I think there's a lot of international agreement that that is not the way that most of us, want to go. And so I think this is a broader conversation actually too, is what is the nature of technology? How do we choose for it to be? It can be applied for good or evil, but if we feel that people benefit from having freedom of religion, freedom of association, and that also drives a lot of the innovations that we've been able to achieve in open societies, that are much more difficult to attain in closed societies, even those who can practice a whole of government, whole of society plan. So
how does, so people would tend to kind of think of this as, oh, this is China's problem. This isn't something that impacts us. But the NBA situation really sort of brought this to the forefront in a lot of ways because it was something that people were finally talking about. How can we capitalize on that, both from a private perspective and a public perspective, to really continue to raise awareness? Because I think for a lot of times you don't notice what's not in the room, right? You don't notice who's not there. And the Hollywood example, for example, folks didn't realize until people started pointing out there are no movies out there that are critical of China, for example. How can we capitalize on sort of this overreach that's occurred and continue to build awareness, but then put that into policy?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those things are already happening, but it is interesting that you asked the question because, I work on this every day, worked on this every day for at least the last 5 years. I wake up thinking about this problem. I'm affected with this problem. But I think this is a problem that we can actually solve. Like the first cartoon I showed you, like we did this to ourselves. We bugged ourselves. We went to max globalism and without a thought for security. We thought about cost, schedule, and performance and everything with, only maybe small afterthoughts for security and not enough endurance to work an issue, all the way through. But we can absolutely turn this around. And what we can do is change our mindset around risk. There's going to be risk. The fortune always favors the offense. And I'm really glad people, largely don't want to attack us kinetically. What a wonderful world, but they are going to continue to attack us asymmetrically, which brings us back to the beginning. We need to, with focus and intent, understand that we have vulnerabilities, seek them out, not hide from them where we find them, work to quickly remediate them, share that information so that our allies aren't afflicted with the same problem, so that we solved it for this company A, but company B still doesn't know. These are the things that we need to work about. This is the new normal. We've fixed this in other domains, and we can fix it in this one too.
What are some of the ways that we can use economic incentives to try to fix some of these things? Because when we look at sort of the winner takes all idea of the economy that sort of kind of evolved over the last 40 years or so, we see that, if I'm not first to market, I'm last, and to make a Ricky Bobby joke. But that was lost in everyone, apparently.
No, a few Gen Xers in here, we get it.
So, but how do we get that paradigm to shift? Because right now, the dominant economic model is, and you had talked previously when we were talking before about maybe staying private, but what are some of the ways that we can really help shift that economic model?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the dialogue in the public sector has been good. it's kind of interesting how the tech companies have been called to account, by the public for their use of personally available information that maybe didn't bring value to the individual's lives. It's good that we have that conversation. At the same time, I mean, think about the top companies that now. Did they exist 50 years ago? Some of the companies that we may be captive to now, in that they are the bigs right now, but there's a new disruptive technology or process coming in that will replace that. It's just natural, not knocking anyone, but we're going to have this churn that's going to give us the opportunity that there's new economic incentives that we can reorient our supply chains in ways that benefit us now, rather than have the sunk cost of, well, it's cheaper, but they took our IP and we'll be out of business in 20 years. Those kind of things are going to be hopefully readdressed. Another thing we can do is we've spent a lot of time in the government trying to, we have a lot of rules. The government of China doesn't have data use rules. They don't worry about, oh, this is this type of information. Can I use it to solve this problem? They just do it. We do enjoy that kind of bifurcation, which helps us make sure that we don't overstep, but it also slows our ability to identify issues and risks and address them. But what we do have that we need to leverage more is the private sector. The private sector can combine all sorts of publicly available, publicly viewable information, apply that, I'll call it like ad tech type talent to that, and deliver this information back to the government in ways that are going to speed up what we're doing and more support continual risk mitigation. Which again, this is the struggle of our age, and it's exciting to be here with so many cybersecurity professionals because you all are at the front of it. You're going to be well employed. Another one topic I wanted to make sure that we address is that it's not just the cyber domain, it's not just the human domain, but in the government we tend to have the ends separated from one another. If you are going to be hopefully providing a service and a career to the government, to the private sector, or anywhere, you need to look at these risks holistically. It's not just ones and zeros. It's not just parts. It's not just ideas. It's also the people. It's the union of all of those things, that provide both opportunities and risk. So,
if we do nothing, where do you see the state of the cybersecurity threat, the cyber environment, the supply chain management? If we do nothing, where do you see us in 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, actually, let's put up the cartoon towards the end. There were some examples of tech theft. So here, I like this cartoon. When I came across this cartoon about 5 years ago, it really kind of reminded me of this problem. This cartoon comes from the 1880s when we were seeking to employ electricity into our cities. It was the new technology, and yet we tried to employ it the old ways that we would have employed telegraph wires. We didn't know how it would make us behave or how it entirely behaved on its own. And so there really was a strong community of folks, a strong movement to roll back electricity and let's not have it, And when you look at this photo, you kind of see an analogy to what's going on now. We've created this really complex, difficult situation. It's hurting a lot of us. And, the policeman, is signifying authority. He's leaving the room. He's vacating, the space. And doesn't that look ridiculous now? I mean, how many of us had a mishap with electricity on the way to work that resulted in grievous injury? Thankfully, none of us. But forward to the photograph. And yet, look, that looks ridiculous, but that was the situation. That's a photo of New York City around the same time frame. So look at how far we've gone in solving that problem. And this is the same general system, the same democracy, the same sort of people that solved that problem that we have here in this room and in other rooms today. So we absolutely can overcome this problem and make this current tech transfer, cybersecurity risk, supply chain risk issue. We can make that look ridiculous. But to your point, if we don't, then technology will more aid the causes of tyranny and oppression than it will aid free market and democracies. And that's the choice, that we get to make.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left. If you were to make some recommendations of what can we take out of this, conversation and really go and do with, what would you ask that people pay attention to, and what are your recommendations, kind of 2 minutes or less?
One, understand that you will have risks in whatever process you have. If you're doing something and you think that you're boring and unimportant, look at the China 2025 plan. If you're on there even tertiarily, or you touch the government, the defense, the biotech industry, you are not boring to adversaries that would want to harm you by stealing your property, by inserting malicious code, by misusing your processes. So understand that it's natural that you have these vulnerabilities and look for them with focus and intent. Two, we have got to, between the public sector and the private sector, we've got to reduce the barriers to sharing information. We have to tip the tables in favor of our defense. And so that's going to cause us to change some of the presets that we have in our minds about what's private, what we should share, whether we should even talk about a vulnerability. I submit we need to move directly towards more openness on that front. And then third is innovation. We need more of our children and more of our workers to go into STEM. We need STEM, but we also need the other sciences that enable them. We also need to intelligently incorporate our allies and partners in that endeavor and step up our research and engineering and innovation budgets throughout the government, but also definitely in the private sector.
One last thing, if you had to make recommendations for what folks should go read, you've already mentioned the China 2020 plan and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you.
What are some final recommendations?
All right,
for
so
folks
on
to get
our
smart?
side, I always love to talk about what to do about it. So what to do about the problem. I would definitely go to the MITRE website and read the Delivered Uncompromised plan. This was a plan that MITRE wrote after being sponsored by the Defense Department on what we could do to change the situation around supply chain security and intellectual property theft. So read that because it'll give you what to do about the problem. And then the second thing I would say to read is the IP Commission published a report, and they publish updates frequently as to the cost of the tech transfer issue with China is another important one. And also, like to your last point, like folks frequently say, hey, we didn't know about this problem. And yet once you start seeing this problem, you can't not see it. There are a lot of very reputable media outlets that cover this kind of news. So look in your phones and find your media aggregator that delivers you this information because it is out there.
All right. I think that's
all right. It's enough for me. Thank you, everybody.